A few months back I made this bedside table using some salvaged wood, and I'll link to the project video for that in the description box below. Anyway, that sold on my Etsy store a couple of weeks ago, and the buyer of the bedside table wrote back to me to say that she was really happy with it, and she wondered if I could make her some drawer box shelves to sit on the opposite side of the bed where she didn't have quite enough space for another bedside table. Originally I was thinking that I might be able to find some second-hand small drawers that I could upcycle, but I was struggling to find any that were the right size, so instead I'm going to be making them from scratch. And I did a quick drawing in SketchUp just to agree the dimensions with the client before getting started. By the way, I have a cold at the moment if you're wondering why I sound a bit weird, or weirder than usual anyway.
For this build I'm going to be using some of this 1/4 inch beech veneered plywood. I started by ripping a few pieces to width at the table saw. I cut a fresh clean edge at the miter saw and then set up a stop block to cut the back panels of the drawer boxes to length. And then I did the same to cut the side panels, and because these pieces were quite short I used a push stick to keep my hands away from the blade. I then sanded both faces of the back and side panels, and I did that by hand because I didn't want to risk sanding through the veneer. I applied glue and then stuck the side panels to the edges of the back panel, and I did it like that so that no plywood edges would be visible on the sides of the boxes. I removed any glue squeeze out with a damp cloth and then got some F-clamps on there. And then I checked to make sure that the sides were at 90 degrees to the back. I could then offer up and mark up the drawer fronts for length and cut them at the miter saw. Those got sanded too, and these panels are going to get painted, so I paid special attention to sanding the edges to get them as smooth as possible, first using 100 grit and then 240. With the glue now dry on the back and side panels, I could glue and clamp the front panels in place.
So the plywood edges on the front panel are going to get painted, and the only other exposed edges would be along the top edges of the drawer boxes. The ones at the bottom don't need hiding as they will be below eye level. To hide the ones along the top edge, I decided to use some offcuts of beech which would match the face veneer of the plywood.
First I used my thickness planer, taking multiple passes, a little at a time until the beech pieces were the same thickness as the plywood. I then offered up my table saw blade to rip some small strips to use as edge banding, and I hot glued a sacrificial fence on to cut each piece to a consistent thickness, which is much safer than cutting them between the real fence and the blade. You'll see here that I decided to change how this was set up because the first ones that I cut were a little bit too thin, so here I'm cutting them a bit thicker. Before adding the banding, I first made sure that all of the top edges were flush, and I did that at the belt sander. Then I could add glue, and I used masking tape to secure the edge banding to the long edges.
The way Easter eggs are being promoted in stores is being criticised.
Confused. I didn't expect.
And then I could cut some shorter pieces for the sides. And I refined the length of those pieces with some sanding to get a nice tight fit. Once the glue was dry, I flush cut the edge banding with my Japanese pull saw. I removed all the tape and then used my block plane to flush up the edges. And then I did some sanding, which really helps to blend the edge banding with the ply. And I also softened over any sharp edges with the sandpaper.
I'm going to use a rebate bit in my router to cut a rebate for a bottom panel to sit in. This bit has a bearing at the bottom which will ride along the inside edges of the box while the cutter cuts the rebate.
For For the bottom panel I had a piece of 5mm plywood which I cut to size, and I wanted to round the edges so that the panel fits in place to the routed corners. I used a large washer to mark up the shape, and I did the shaping at the disc sander. It fitted nicely, so then I added glue and I used my air stapler to fix it in place while the glue dried.
The client wanted one of the drawers to be yellow to match the drawer front of the bedside table and the other to be grey to match the carcass. Fortunately, I still had some of the grey paint that I used in my shed. I didn't have any of the yellow though, but fortunately I could still remember what the colour of the paint was, so I just bought another tester pot. This was about £1 and it'll be plenty enough paint to get this job done.
Before adding the paint, I first masked up the areas that I didn't want to get paint on. Once the paint was dry, I denibbed with 400 grit wet and dry paper to keep them smooth, and then I recoated. Then I could remove the masking tape. I used some acrylic spray varnish as a top coat, which will help to protect the paint and make it more hard wearing, and it also pops the grain of the sides and tops of the drawer boxes too. The final job was to fit some of these keyhole fixing plates so that these would be easy to mount onto the wall just by adding a couple of screws. I wanted to recess them into the back panel so that the boxes would fit flush to the wall. I decided to place them 20 centimeters apart on center, that way I could give the customer clear and simple instructions about how to fit them to the wall. After measuring and marking them up, I drilled the holes to a depth of about 2mm. And rather than drilling pilot holes, because the screws I'm using are so small, I just used an awl to start the hole and then screwed them in place. And then I added my maker's mark to the back panel.
The client wanted, in her words, some random handles on the drawers, and I sent her some photos of the salvaged handles that I have already. I like to keep things like handles as they're always useful. She chose this round brass one for the grey drawer and this brass plated one for the yellow drawer.
I had to cut the bolts back a bit using a hacksaw to shorten them. For the grey drawer, I found a centre point by offering up a ruler from corner to corner, and then I drilled a hole for the bolt and screwed the handle in place.
I think the best, like, proper ultimate mum's name on Mother's Day. Really open a can of worms this now. JK, really good chat this. It's called...
The other drawer handle was going to be a little bit trickier to fit because I couldn't just tighten the bolts by hand. I do have a little stubby screwdriver though that I thought might do the job. Unfortunately though, even without the extension bit fitted, it still wasn't quite short enough to fit inside the box. So instead I just used one of these bits to tighten the screws and pliers to give me some extra leverage.
This project took around 6 hours to complete, and on screen now are some photos of the finished boxes. Now I just need to package them up and send them to my customer on Etsy. This was a nice, quick and simple project to do, and I'll be making some more of these and listing them on my Etsy store in the near future. I'd also like to try the idea of using salvaged drawers to make these boxes too, so perhaps that's one for the future too. I think they make for a really nice alternative to a bedside table. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please subscribe to my channel if you haven't already for more weekly woodworking videos. You can also support the channel on Patreon if you'd like to receive early access to my videos, project cut lists and plans, exclusive content and a name credit at the end of my videos, and there'll be a link to that in the description box below. Thank you for watching.